In Canada, an Indian reserve is specified by the Indian Act as a tract of land, the legal title to which is vested in Her Majesty, that has been set apart by Her Majesty for the use and benefit of a band. Indian reserves are the areas set aside for First Nations people after a contact with the Canadian state, and not to be confused with land claims areas, which involves all of that First Nations traditional lands, a much larger territory than any reserve. Demographics: a single band may control one reserve or several. In addition, some reserves are shared between multiple bands. In 2003, the Department of Indian Affairs stated there were 2,300 reserves in Canada, comprising 28,000 square kilometers. According to Statistics Canada, in 2011 there are more than 600 First Nations Indian bands in Canada and 3,100 Indian reserves across Canada. Examples include the Sturgeon Lake First Nation, which like many bands, has only one reserve, Sturgeon Lake Indian Reserve No. 101, Musqueam No. 2 and No. 4, and Sea Island Indian Reserve No. 3 are governed by the Musqueam Indian Band, one of many examples where a single government has more than one reserve. In 2003, 60% of status Indians lived on reserves. Of the 637,660 First Nations people who reported being registered Indians, nearly one-half lived on an Indian reserve. This proportion varies across the country. Many reserves have no resident population. Typically they are small, remote, discontiguous pieces of land, which has led many to be abandoned, or used only seasonally. Statistics Canada only counts reserves which are populated as subdivisions for the purpose of the national census. For the 2011 census, of the more than 3,100 Indian reserves across Canada, there were only 961 Indian reserves classified as census subdivisions. Some reserves that were originally rural were gradually surrounded by urban development. Montreal, Vancouver and Calgary are examples of cities with urban reserves. Governance: one band chief and council commonly administer more than one reserve, such as the Beaver Lake Cree Nation with 2 reserves, or the Lenape people, who are in Canada incorporated as the Munsee Delaware Nation and who occupy Munsee Delaware Nation Indian Reserve No. 1, consists of 3 discontiguous parcels of land, totally 1,054 hectares, within the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, 42 near Munsee, Ontario, which was formerly shared between them and the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation as a single parcel of land. Some reserves are shared by multiple bands, whether as fishing camps or educational facilities such as Pequalis, a reserve on the Fraser River which is used by 21 Indian bands. It was formerly St. Mary's Indian Residential School and is an example of a reserve created in modern times. Another multi-band reserve of the Stow peoples is Grass Indian Reserve No. 15, which is located in the city of Chilliwack and is shared by 9 bands. Constitution Act 1867. In 1867, legislative jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for the Indians was assigned to the Parliament of Canada through the Constitution Act 1867, a major part of Canada's constitution, originally enacted as the British North America Act, which acknowledged that First Nations had special status, separate powers, covered status and civil rights on the one hand and Indian lands on the other. In 1870 the newly formed Dominion government acquired Rupert's Land, a vast territory in British North America, consisting mostly of the Hudson Bay drainage basin, that had been controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company under its charter with the British Crown from 1670 to 1870. Numerous Aboriginal groups lived in the same territory and disputed the sovereignty of the area. The Dominion of Canada promised Britain to honour the provisions of the Proclamation of 1763 to negotiate with its Amerindians for the extinguishment of the title and the setting aside of reserves for their exclusive use. This promise led to the numbered treaties and reserves pre-1867. After the Royal Proclamation and before Confederation in 1867, the Upper Canada Treaties and the Douglas Treaties were signed. Some of these pre-Confederation and post-Confederation treaties addressed reserve lands, hunting, fishing, trapping rights, annuities and other benefits. Governor Douglas of British Columbia, which formerly became a colony in 1858, also worked to establish many reserves on the mainland during his tenure, though most of these were overturned by successor colonial governments and later royal commissions once the province joined Confederation in 1871. Numbered treaties 1871 to 1921. Between 1871 and 1921, through numbered treaties with First Nations, the Canadian government gained large areas of land for settlers and for industry in northwestern Ontario, northern Canada and in the prairies. The treaties, also called the Land Cession or Post-Confederation Treaties. Treaty 1 was a controversial agreement established August 3, 1871 between Queen Victoria and various First Nations in southeastern Manitoba, including the Chippewa and Swampy Cree tribes. Treaty 1 First Nations comprise the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation, Fort Alexander, Long Plain First Nation, Peguay First Nation, Roseau River Anishinaabe First Nation, Sandy Bay First Nation and Swan Lake First Nation. The Indian Act 1876. The rights and freedoms of Canada's First Nations people have been governed by the Indian Act since its enactment in 1876 by the Parliament of Canada. The provisions of Section 91 of the Constitution Act 1867 provided Canada's federal government exclusive authority to legislate in relation to Indians and lands reserved for Indians. Wikwemikong Unceded Reserve on Manitoulin Island is subject to the Indian Act provisions governing reserves even though its lands were never ceded to the Crown by treaty. Indian Act. The Indian Act gives the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs the right to determine whether any purpose for which lands in a reserve are used is for the use and benefit of the band. Title to land within the reserve may only be transferred to the band or to individual band members. Reserve lands may not be seized legally, nor is the personal property of a band or a band member living on a reserve subject to charge, pledge, mortgage, attachment, levy, seizure, distress or execution in favor or at the instance of any person other than an Indian or a band of the GCA. Indian Act. Government of Canada. CMHC on Indian reserves. While the Act was intended to protect the Indian holdings, the limitations make it difficult for the reserves and the residents to obtain financing for development and construction or renovation. To answer this need, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has created an on-reserve housing loan program. Members of bands may enter into a trust agreement with CMHC, and lenders can receive loans to build or repair houses. In other programs, loans to residents of reserves are guaranteed by the federal government. Provinces and municipalities may expropriate reserve land only if specifically authorized by a provincial or federal law. Few reserves have any economic advantages, such as resource revenues. The revenues of those reserves which do are held in trust by the Minister of Indian Affairs. Reserve lands and the personal property of bands and resident band members are exempt from all forms of taxation except local taxation. Corporations owned by members of First Nations are not exempt, however. This exemption has allowed band members operating in proprietorships or partnerships to sell heavily taxed goods, such as cigarettes, on the reserves at prices considerably lower than those at stores off the reserves. Most reserves are self-governed within the limits already described, under guidelines established by the Indian Act. Due to treaty settlements, some Indian reserves are now incorporated as villages, such as New Ayunch, British Columbia, which, like other NISGAA reserves, was relieved of that status by the NISGAA Treaty. Similarly, the Indian reserves of the Sekelt Indian Band are now Indian government districts. Public policy. Indian reserves play a very important role in public policy stakeholder consultations, particularly when reserves are located in areas that have valuable natural resources with potential for economic development. Beginning in the 1970s, First Nations gained recognition of the constitutionally protected rights. First Nations rights are protected by Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982. By 2002, First Nations had already finalized 14 comprehensive land claims and self-government agreements, with numerous others, primarily in northern Canada and British Columbia, at different stages of negotiations. Land claims and self-government agreements are modern treaties, and therefore hold constitutional status. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act, 1999, places Aboriginal participation on par with federal ministers and the provinces in the National Advisory Committee. Quote, among other things, CEPA clarified the term Aboriginal land in 3. The definitions in this subsection apply in this Act. Aboriginal land means reserves, surrendered lands and any other lands that are set apart for the use and benefit of a band and that are subject to the Indian Act. Quote, under Sections 46 to 50 of the CEPA, Environment Canada's National Pollutant Release Inventory was initiated. NPRI is the inventory of pollutants released, disposed of and sent for recycling by facilities across the country. The NPRI is used by First Nation administrations on reserves, along with other research tools, to monitor pollution. For example, NPRI data from Environment Canada's National Pollutant Release Inventory showed the Armjivnam First Nation in Sarnia, Ontario was ground zero for Ontario's heaviest load of air pollution. Water quality. By 2006, nearly 100 Indian reserves had boil water advisories and many others had substandard water. Quiquashitnikzu Haxwamis First Nation, on an island off the British Columbia coast, had a boil water advisory since 1997. In October 2005, high E. coli levels were found in the Kashechewan First Nation reserves' drinking water, and chlorine levels had to be increased to shock levels, causing skin problems and eventually resulting in an evacuation of hundreds of people from the reserve and costing approximately $16 million. Citations